Welcome to the Hadean Eon, where chaos ensues, but the Earth begins. 4.6 billion years ago, our region of the galaxy consisted of these large, dense gas clouds, the remains of dead stars, as well as large living stars. One of them went supernova, and this sent shockwaves through space, infiltrating our solar nebula, and this triggered the formation of a protoplanetary disk. Most of the gas and dust collected near the center of it, and because of angular momentum, it starts spinning. It turns into a disk. As enough mass and pressure and heat builds in the center of the disk, you get our sun. Surrounding our little baby sun are fragments of rock and little dust particles that, because of static electricity, start combining together. And like a small snowball rolling down a hill, it gains momentum and larger pieces clump together due to gravity. And over time, you have a planetesimal. In our early solar system, there were tons of these planetesimals, just bumping around each other and smashing into each other, forming larger and larger ones. One of these planetesimals gains enough mass and becomes the Earth. But it's very hot, it's very molten because of all those rocks bombarding it. So the Earth was literally a big ball of liquidy magma covered in magma oceans. Now the denser elements like iron and nickel sunk to the core of the Earth, whereas the less dense stuff like silicon, calcium, carbon, those raise to the top and become the crust eventually. About 4.5 billion years ago, another Mars-sized planetesimal comes in and smashes right into the Earth. And a chunk of the Earth actually flies out into space and begins to orbit around the Earth and becomes the Moon. Over the next 100 million years, Earth's magma surface begins to cool down, and we start seeing volcanic activity. Rocks start solidifying in the mantle and the crust, and they start outgassing through volcanoes back into the atmosphere. Now, a lot of the rock that solidified in the mantle and the crust were hydrates. These contained water. Water begins to outgas into the atmosphere, and we get the first small thin atmosphere of water, carbon dioxide. Carbon from the mantle and oxygen and other rocks start binding together and forming CO2. So now we start seeing the first atmosphere about 4.4 billion years ago on the Earth. As the Earth cools down even further, we start seeing a very thin crust start forming on the surface, as well as all that evaporated water vapor condensing into liquid, raining down as liquid oceans around the planet. So a lot of the water in our oceans comes from beneath the Earth's surface. A lot of the water also comes from meteorites that struck the Earth and contained hydrates inside of them. Carbonaceous chondrites, they're called. Now, 4.3 billion years ago, plate tectonics didn't exist the way it does today. Back then, the Earth's surface was too warm and the crust was too thin, and there wasn't enough there for it to fragment and solidify into these pieces that we can call plates. That didn't happen yet. During this time, Earth's crust was kind of like making pudding. You know how when you leave pudding out, it kind of makes this crusty layer on top? That was kind of like what the Earth's surface was like at this time. It wasn't very solid yet, so we couldn't have plate tectonics happen. Now, at this time, we do see the beginnings of Earth's magnetic field. The inner core radiates heat and causes convection in the outer core. So we have molten iron and molten nickel in the outer core, which sinks and falls and sinks and falls, and this creates convection zones. Currents emerge where you have electricity build. And as the Earth spins, it directs the flow of these currents and creates the larger magnetic field. Now, by 4.1 billion years ago, the Earth is becoming relatively stable now. It has a nice atmosphere of CO2 and methane and ammonia. It also has liquid water oceans that are kind of close to boiling temperature. However, we see another phase of bombardment of space rocks. However, these space rocks contain organic molecules. So they bombard the Earth and seed the stuff of life. Deep under the oceans of the Earth, where these cracks, where magma can seep up and cause smoke and other nutrients to seep out of it. These are hydrothermal vents. These areas catalyze the reactions required for those organic molecules to assimilate into things like amino acids. They also catalyze the reactions for making lipid molecules, which make up the cell wall. Things like carbon monoxide and hydrogen combine to make lipid molecules. And in water, lipid molecules create lipid bilayers, which can form spherical structures that encapsulate other molecules. Those amino acids, under the right conditions, can combine themselves into peptides, and those peptides can form themselves into polypeptides, and those polypeptides can form sheets of things called amyloids, which can break apart and perform autocatalysis, creating new amino acids on their own. And this is what scientists think was the first proto-metabolic process on Earth. And when you have this encapsulated by a cell membrane, you have a first protocell. And after a series of chemical evolutionary steps of circulating these organic structures on top of the surface, down below, where you have heating and drying from the sun and rain, and all these things catalyze larger and more complicated molecules. All these steps which were necessary for producing the first self-replicating organic structure on the Earth, we think about 4.0 billion years ago. And that marks the end of the chaotic Hadean Eon, but the beginning of everything that we love and know. One of the most critical eons in Earth's history is the Archean. This was a time when the Earth was covered in oceans. The only land were volcanoes here and there. There were no continents yet. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere yet. The sun was 25% dimmer than it is today. Our sun was an early star. It was in its adolescence. It was burning hydrogen into helium. Helium was starting to accumulate near the core, increasing its density. Increasing temperatures and pressures at the core aided further nuclear fusion, which then creates more energy that can bombard the Earth. But 4 billion years ago, the sun wasn't luminous enough to create liquid water on Earth's surface. But we still find evidence of liquid water on Earth at this time. How could this be? Well, the answer is Archaea. Some of the earliest forms of life on the Earth were methanogenic archaea, which produced methane into the atmosphere, trapping enough heat from the sun to keep temperatures in the lower atmosphere warm enough for liquid water. Without those early archaea and bacteria producing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, Earth's water may have frozen over, stopping any evolution of further life. It could be the case that life may have never taken off if it weren't for those early bacteria. Still at this time, 3.9 billion years ago, the Earth's atmosphere was lacking in oxygen. It was dominated by methane and CO2 and things like hydrogen, which would have made the Earth's atmosphere look orange. It would have been a methane haze surrounding the Earth at this time. Early bacteria were using chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis, right? They weren't using the sun. They were using things like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron. They were metabolizing it because it was a simpler process. So these guys began to diversify into the oceans, thriving near hydrothermal vents or volcanic ponds. So for hundreds of millions of years, these guys were just eating away at all this iron and sulfur and nitrogen in the oceans, clearing it away. And remember, before this time, the oceans were very toxic. It's like sludgy, and you didn't want to be in them, right? Because there was no multicellular life yet. There was just single-celled organisms. So these early bacteria in archaea really helped to stabilize the environment. They also unleashed lots of bioavailable nutrients for complex life to come later. So they laid the groundwork for complex multicellular life. Then 3.5 billion years ago, we get the introduction of cyanobacteria, algae, which can now start using photosynthesis, and now they're beginning to create some oxygen. And we have the fossilized remains of these ancient bacteria in things called stromatolites. Ancient microbes would create these mats on top of rocks, and they would just keep building upon these layers of film because they would secrete this film-like substance. And they would just keep building for thousands of years into these huge microbial mats, where eventually it became this entire ecosystem where certain layers would actually be fed by other layers. It was a really amazing, intricate thing. These were like the first coral reefs of the oceans. They lived in shallow waters, and they would create oxygen for the Earth. Another insane relic we have from these ancient cyanobacteria are banded iron formations. Microbes in the ocean would produce lots of oxygen, but that oxygen would then react with the iron, the free iron in the oceans. This would create iron oxide, rust. So rust we know is red. All that rust would precipitate out of the oceans and form these rock formations from these ancient bacteria. And now we get to look at them 3.4 billion years later, and they look awesome. And for the next billion years, cyanobacteria using photosynthesis dominated the Earth. And this leads us to the Great Oxidation Event 2.4 billion years ago. As the cyanobacteria were creating all this oxygen in the atmosphere, the oxygen was being consumed again by rocks and other things in the environment. So oxygen levels in the atmosphere were not rising that high. However, the environment then became saturated with all that oxygen. It couldn't take in any more. And this is when cyanobacteria began to really dominate and beat out all the other archaea and bacteria that didn't utilize photosynthesis. So around 2.2 billion years ago, the oxygen levels of the Earth reach about 5% of what it is today. And we see the first blue skies. With the anaerobic bacteria poisoned by oxygen, almost all life went extinct, and cyanobacteria flourished during this time, producing more and more oxygen. And all those past events laid the foundation for now the introduction of eukaryotic life, a bit more complicated than prokaryotic life, which is what the Earth has only seen until this point about 1.6 billion years ago. Scientists think that those microbial mats we were talking about before, those ecosystems really fostered this kind of endosymbiotic relationship between these prokaryotes. So a prokaryote is simply a single-celled organism with no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles, right? There's no mitochondria, there's no chloroplast, none of that stuff. But what we think is that these eukaryotes emerged when a prokaryotic host cell engulfed another one, and the one that was engulfed became the organelles encapsulated by membrane. So this is called endosymbiosis, in which we get the emergence of a more complicated organism from simpler ones. And the fact that there was more oxygen in the atmosphere enabled these eukaryotes to become more complicated, right? It aided their metabolism. And because these microbial mats were so prevalent during this time in these shallow seas, it provided the perfect ecosystems for these eukaryotes to form. And it's in those early eukaryotes, 1.5 billion years ago, where we see the evolution of more specialized organelles that give rise to gene regulation and building cytoskeletons and building nuclear membranes, things that help multicellular life. So although there were no extravagant organisms at this time, 3-4 billion years ago, the first couple billion years of Earth's history were not boring. They were some of the most critical moments, the most critical events happened during this time that really laid the foundation for life as we know it. The Proterozoic Eon, when life goes from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms. 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria, which use photosynthesis, really begin to flourish during this time. Stromatolites dominate shallow waters. Oxygen levels begin to really creep up in the atmosphere during this time, and this causes lots of anaerobic bacteria to start dying off because oxygen is toxic to them. 2.2 billion years ago is when plate tectonics really begins to start. The crust of the Earth is cool and brittle enough to start cracking into different plates. So we see the formation of the first true supercontinent called Nuna. This is also when methane levels begin to drop because all the bacteria that produced it started dying off, as well as the fact that oxygen levels in the atmosphere kind of ate away at the methane that was present, turned into CO2, which was less effective as a greenhouse gas. So the Earth begins to see its first real glaciation events where there's ice caps, and ice covers a significant portion of the Earth in the Huronian glaciation period. Then about 1.6 billion years ago, we start seeing eukaryotes, some of the more complex single-celled organisms with specialized parts like mitochondria, and they form by engulfing other cells. And over time, these eukaryotes begin to develop more and more complicated organelles and parts and systems which enable them to perform sexual reproduction 1.2 billion years ago. This yields even more genetic diversity, and it increases their adaptability. 1.0 billion years ago, we see the formation and then breakup of another supercontinent called Rodinia. So as it breaks apart, it creates these shallow waters, which nutrients come flowing down into and release into the oceans, which life can use. So life is thriving, eukaryotes are thriving, but about 800 million years ago, we see another glaciation event, and this one is bad. It's almost the entire Earth is covered in snow and ice. And scientists today are finding evidence of icebergs at the equator. 800 million years ago, they're finding these drop stones. These are stones that only weather by being moved by icebergs. So they don't weather in water, they weather in ice. And these drop stones are found at the seafloor very near to the equator, almost around the entire Earth, which signifies that in the past, the Earth was once a snowball. However, life still existed during these glaciation events. So scientists think that because of the stress of the event and the fact that there is limited resources during this time, eukaryotic life began to aggregate into colonies. They started forming these colonies of cells and work together. Certain proteins like cadherins allowed for single-celled organisms to stick together. They were literally glued together and formed these cohesive structures of multi-celled organisms. So because of this, this allowed for certain cells in the structure to focus on certain things like eating. Some things would focus on reproduction. So they would form different types of specialized cells in these groups. Literally sticking together allowed these groups of cells to survive and manage in these extreme environments where there was less resources available. Also at this time, single-celled organisms were engulfing one another in symbiosis. So being multicellular, being larger, allowed you to survive and not be engulfed. So as the very first complex organisms began to prey on one another, it forced the evolution of more complex defense mechanisms and attacking mechanisms that will allow them to survive better, okay? Specialized cells that gave rise to different body parts like mouths and ears. Then about 640 million years ago is when we have very clear evidence of the first animals to emerge on the Earth. These are called the Ediacaran biota. Things like sponges, Kimberella, things like Dickinsonia. These are very soft-bodied organisms that lived near the seafloor. Very small, maybe a few centimeters in size. And these guys would just filter feed near shallow oceans. So they would just consume these dead particles, bacteria, algae that were just suspended in the ocean. Some would lay at the bottom of the seafloor and bottom feed and just eat all kinds of dead stuff on the bottom. Some of these animals would also consume bacteria in microbial mats. These guys would flourish in these waters for the next 100 million years and become more evolved and more complicated, setting up the stage for the Cambrian explosion. What caused the Cambrian explosion? Before that time, most of the life on the Earth were just bacteria, and the only animals were really like sea sponges and jellyfish-like animals. That's it. But then suddenly, we see this explosion of biodiversity with all kinds of larger animals with shells and exoskeletons and complicated organs and segmented body structures. How did this happen? Well, a lot of people forget that the Earth was being primed for the Cambrian explosion 100 million years before it ever happened. 660 million years ago, the Earth was freezing over, almost entirely covered in glaciers. It's called a snowball Earth period, where a lot of multicellular life died out. It caused lots of extinctions. It was like a reset button for the Earth. But also during this time, the supercontinent called Rodinia was starting to break apart, and this disrupted ocean circulation and started to thaw out that snowball Earth. The breaking up of the continent also caused shallow seas to emerge, where life could thrive again. The shallow seas were dominated by microbial mats, by cone jellies, and by sea sponges, were some of the first animals ever. Over millions of years, as those glaciers from snowball Earth began to melt, they ran off into the rocks, and it caused lots of those nutrients like calcium and phosphorus to run off into the seas, where the living organisms utilized those new nutrients. This sparked the explosion of cyanobacteria again, which caused them to utilize photosynthesis and produce oxygen. So now oxygen levels really started to ramp up around 620 million years ago. 40 million years later, as you have more oxygen in the atmosphere and in the oceans, as you have warmer climates, as you have more nutrients in the oceans, what you have is the Avalon explosion, a diversification of life. You have the Sperginas. These are these disc-like shaped animals that in the oceans. They look like the trilobites. They are the precursors to trilobites. You also have the Parvincorines, which are also disc-shaped like animals. So even in the Ediacaran time, before the Cambrian period, you still see a diversification of life slowly creeping up, and you see more oxygen build up, and you see these organisms utilizing oxygen for their metabolism, which makes them able to be larger and more complicated. A very key thing to understand here is that the rocks were sequestering oxygen. As oxygen was building in the atmosphere, rocks were taking it in. As it rained, it would cause carbonates to form in the rocks, and so the rocks would lock in that oxygen. But this was slowly declining because those rocks could only be saturated so much with it. Now it's 540 million years ago, just as the Cambrian period begins. The Earth is primed up for a Cambrian explosion because there's lots of oxygen in the atmosphere and less in the rocks. As the rocks are becoming saturated with it, all the oxygen can really build up in the atmosphere and in the oceans. You also have fairly low diversity of life in the oceans right now. You don't have any animals or predators that have jaws yet. The jaws didn't exist yet. Eyes barely just started to form. Predator and prey dynamics don't really exist yet. There aren't any predators yet, because most of these animals in the oceans were just bottom feeders. They were just scavengers. They were just, they would just filter in things and nutrients from the ocean. They weren't really preying on other animals because oxygen wasn't high enough yet in the oceans to power these animals and power the complexity of all these different features that we're now going to begin to see. The Cambrian explosion kicks off 540 million years ago. There are no trees, there's no grass, that didn't evolve yet. There's just sea life in the oceans. Earth was warmer at this time, and there was less oxygen in the atmosphere. Ice and glaciers were still melting coming out of the snowball Earth period. All that water would run off into the oceans and drag with it calcium, phosphorus, and other minerals which the ocean life would use. And they begin to utilize those new nutrients to form shells and exoskeletons and something called biomineralization. So what was once an ocean full of soft-bodied animals like jellyfish and sponges is now becoming an ocean full of more complicated and more diverse organisms with hard bodies and shells and skeletons. And as oxygen levels were spiking during this time as well, animals would use the oxygen to aid in the ATP production, which helps their metabolism and helps them grow bigger and more complex. And 520 million years ago, an arms race begins in the animal kingdom as predators begin to emerge and prey begins to emerge, and we have predator-prey dynamics. Hunters like the Anomaloceros pressures its prey to adapt and form better shells and stronger speeds and stronger senses, which helps them survive against the predators. And this competition between predator and prey catalyzes the evolution of more complicated body parts to keep up, like better eyesight, better nervous systems, more complicated organs, body segmentation, right? Legs begin to emerge, and gill slits, and all these things. And then about 515 million years ago, a very key thing happened. The Hox gene begins to duplicate, undergo duplication. And this Hox gene is responsible for creating the body plans, the morphologies of these animals. So as these genes duplicated in these animals' bodies, their bodies were able to become more complicated. And 510 million years ago, another game changer, jaws evolve. Jaws that can bite and munch on other beings. This causes more predation and more prey to scatter around and for them to adapt even more. And this causes an explosion of biodiversity of life in the oceans. Then about 490 million years ago, ecosystems kind of stabilize, oxygen levels kind of peak, and animals in the ocean begin to see refinements in their eyes, in the nervous systems, in their shells. This is where we see trilobites really begin to diversify, and these trilobites exist for the next few hundred million years. But other animals during the Cambrian period, like chordates, which are kind of like small fish-like animals, went on to become our ancestors as they leave the oceans, go on to land, and become our ancestors. And by 480 million years ago, the Cambrian period kind of ends, and the Cambrian explosion kind of settles down. So the Cambrian explosion wasn't as sudden as people make it out to be. It didn't just happen in one day. It took millions of years and many small incremental steps for the Cambrian explosion to really take place. And as we saw in the first video, the Earth had to prime up for this explosion to happen. If the Earth didn't undergo those previous changes environmentally, there would be no Cambrian explosion. It's also the case that when we look at the fossil record, it's hard to find the fossilized remains of soft-bodied animals. It's way easier to find the fossilized remains of shellfish and hard-bodied animals. So it could be the case that before the Cambrian, there was actually quite a bit of diversity. It's just that we can't see it 500 million years later. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed these two videos, and remember, learning about our past is important because it helps us understand and also appreciate our lives today. Just after the Cambrian explosion is when life makes its move from the seas to the land, and we see some very exotic life forms. 470 million years ago, life in the oceans is thriving with arthropods like trilobites and sea scorpions dominating. As the waters become more abundant in complex life and animals begin feeding on algae, green algae adapts the ability to survive in drier conditions, and it moves inland towards terrestrial environments on land where they can survive in these moist soils. 460 million years ago, we see the first land plants, which didn't have any roots or leaves yet. These early land plants start diversifying on land, producing oxygen from carbon dioxide. It's around this time that the supercontinent Gondwana started drifting around the South Pole. There was almost no land in northern latitudes, and this caused lots of ice to form on that continent. And the fact that CO2 levels were decreasing in the atmosphere meant less greenhouse gases, which means more glaciation. So we get another extinction event happen in the late Ordovician, where 85% of marine species die out because of the cold. But 440 million years ago, as Gondwana starts breaking apart, glaciers start melting, and ocean environments start recovering. We see the comeback of arthropods, brachiopods are thriving, and some trilobites survived, and we start seeing the first coral reefs. 430 million years ago, we start seeing the first truly vascular land plants with basic roots and stems, like one called Cooksonia. By this time, lots of those plants had generated enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support land animals for the first time. The arthropods are the first ones to make it on land and escape the competition in the ocean environments. These are spider-like and millipede-like animals that were durable and robust because of their exoskeleton. 420 million years ago, we move into the Devonian Period, also called the Age of the Fishes. This is where placoderms, or armored fish, early sharks, and bony fish start diversifying in the oceans. This is also when lobe-finned fish emerge. They have stronger, more robust fins. 400 million years ago, we see the first trees and the first forests emerge on land. Some of the first trees called Archaeopteris. These guys had wood and fern-like leaves. It would continue to increase oxygen levels and stabilize the soils. These early trees would secrete acids that would break down rocks in the ground and create some of the very first soils. Land plants would also engage in symbiosis with fungi, establish networks and roots and connections that would increase their nutrient availability. And this is where we see one of the strangest creatures to ever emerge on the Earth, Prototaxites. It was a 26-foot tall fungus. For the longest time, scientists had no idea how to classify this thing. Was it a fungus, an algae, a plant? What was it? When scientists examined their fossils, they look like wood, but they're actually not, because they're consisted of these tube-like structures inside of them, resembling more fungi. But over the next few million years, we see those terrestrial arthropods, those insect-like animals, evolve finally into true insects. But they hadn't evolved wings yet. These were all flightless insects. And 390 million years ago is when we see the first amphibians move onto land. Now, mind you, during this time, a lot of the trees were starting to grow and produce oxygen, so oxygen levels were finally enough for even fish-like animals to survive on land. Because remember, fish also need oxygen to survive. It's just that they don't have lungs like we do. They have gills, which they can absorb the oxygen from the water. However, with the expansion of trees, this was causing eutrophication in the waters. In other words, nutrients would run off from these enriched forests, and this would spark algae blooms in the waters and deprive the waters of oxygen. Also keep in mind that during this time, the oceans were full of predators. Like, you don't want to stay there very long. You want to get out of the oceans as fast as you can. So remember those lobe-finned fish we were talking about before? The ones with those robust and strong fins? Well, because of the sea levels fluctuating so much in the Devonian, from glaciers melting and sea levels rising and falling, these lobe-finned fish were very adapted to dry, muddy areas where they can crawl to get oxygen. They would move from low oxygen waters to higher oxygen waters. Those lobe-finned fish also had very primitive lungs and air sacs, which made them less reliant on those higher oxygen levels, so now they can leave the oceans. And over time, their limbs became stronger and stronger and more adapted to the terrestrial environments where they can now eat insects, they had habitats near trees, and there was enough oxygen for them to really grow and maintain their complexity. And this is where we see the first tetrapods, the first four-legged animals, things like Ichthyostega. By 380 million years ago, trees evolved the ability to produce seeds instead of spores, which rely on the wind. And by 370 million years ago, as trees and plants take off, this leads to more oxygen depletion in the waters and causes another series of extinction events, leading us into the Carboniferous Period. The Carboniferous Period was a heck of a time to be alive on the Earth. It was a time before the dinosaurs, 360 million years ago, when the Earth was littered with swampy forests, and oxygen levels had peaked at the highest level they've ever been, at 35% of the atmosphere, compared to today's 21% of the atmosphere. It was also the age of the amphibians, and a time when giant insects dominated the land. By the beginning of this period, trees had already begun to emerge on land, but they started evolving something called lignin, which is a particular fiber that is very difficult to decompose. In swampy forests near the equator, trees were really rapidly growing. When they decayed and died, they weren't actually being decomposed by the bacteria and the fungi because they didn't evolve yet. And as these trees died, they fell into the swampy waters, which were low in oxygen. They were stagnant waters, which didn't really circulate very well. They didn't really take in any O2. So these trees decayed in the waters and they turned to sludge, peat. And over time, over millions of years, layers of sediment deposited over top those layers of peat. It got further down, right, more pressure, squeezed out lots of stuff, and it turned to coal. So in fact, most of the coal we use today to power up our power plants comes from these trees in the Carboniferous that kind of compacted on top of each other over millions of years. Amphibians were diversifying and increasingly making their way further inland. And for the longest time, their fish ancestors were so tied to the oceans or freshwater because they had to lay their eggs in water. They were very soft. But now, amphibians had evolved amniotic eggs, which can build membranes inside of them and protect the embryo. And now they can lay the eggs outside of the waters. And the higher oxygen levels in the air allowed them to grow larger and spurred further embryonic development. And the higher oxygen levels also enabled insects to grow to giant proportions, like the Arthroplura, which is a giant millipede that was about 2.5 meters, right, 7 or 8 feet long. And then there's the Meganeura, which is like a dragonfly of today, but about 5 times larger. Their wingspans could reach up to 3 feet long. And then there's the Pulmonoscorpius, which was a giant scorpion that could reach almost 2 meters tall. In the oceans during this time, coming out of the Cambrian Period, there's lots of diversification going on in the oceans, and we have some of the first sharks emerge, as well as a giant fish called Rhizidus, which reached up to 23 feet long. This period also saw some really interesting ammonoids develop, one of them called Rhinoceros. Kind of looked like a squid, cousin of the squid, but it grew up to 1 meter in length. Now, as we head towards the late Carboniferous Period, we see a decline in CO2 and we see a decline in global temperatures. Because of so many swampy areas and so many lush forests dominating the land at the time, they were sequestering all that CO2 because they were just growing so rapidly and they weren't decaying. Remember that bacteria and the fungi didn't exist to really decompose the lignin in these trees. Normally, bacteria comes, eats away the plant, and releases that CO2 back into the atmosphere, but that wasn't happening. So, as CO2 decreased, temperatures also decreased with it. But just after the Carboniferous, we see those bacteria and fungi start to evolve, they start eating away at all those plants, and oxygen levels that were once peaked at 35% because of all those trees started to rapidly decline again. And about 298 million years ago marks the end, the Carboniferous Period. If the asteroid never struck the Earth 66 million years ago and the dinosaurs were never wiped out, humanity would have never happened. And the same can be said for the dinosaurs themselves. They owe their existence to 2 mass extinctions, one that happened right before their existence, and the other right when they were beginning. 250 million years ago, right before the dinosaurs, was the largest extinction event ever known in history, called the Great Dying. All the continents on the Earth were smashing together into one large supercontinent called Pangaea. The center of the continent was so dry because water from the outside of it, the oceans, couldn't make its way inland, and that caused so many droughts, causing the slow but gradual extinction of many species at the center of the continent. And even worse, as the continents were converging together, they started trapping all the heat from the mantle. It was bubbling up under the surface, and all that superheated lava was bubbling up and turning into a gigantic mantle plume, which had nowhere to go because all the continents were smashed together. So it opened a giant wound in the center of the continent, and bam, all that heat and all that toxic chemicals and smoke and all that stuff came bursting out, causing one of the largest extinctions ever. 96% of all marine life died out because all those toxic chemicals went into the ocean. The oceans became stagnant. The air was full of carbon dioxide. It really got heated up over time, caused immense global warming. And the toxic chemicals in the atmosphere burned away the ozone layer. So all that toxic radiation now came burrowing down onto the surface and wiping out 70% of all land species and 96% of all marine species. Even the trilobites, which existed for hundreds of millions of years before this, they were completely wiped out by this event. And what remained after that was a very dry, barren land. And the only species that really survived on land were the Lystrosaurus, which was a mammalian-like reptile. It was kind of mammal, but also kind of reptile. It had traits of both, but it survived because it was hardy. It was able to eat roots and tubers from the ground, and they can burrow underground and survive the extreme temperatures. They were dominant at this time. They were like pretty much the only land animals you would see because they had no other competition. But meanwhile, there were some reptiles still left, one of them called the Proterosaurus, which gave rise to the Archosaurs, which were the ancestors of the dinosaurs. It took nearly 30 million years to recover from that event, where life gradually and slowly came back. Along the coasts, you have vegetation starting to move more inland, like ferns and conifers, started moving inland towards the center of Pangaea. As the oceans recovered slowly, you have reptiles begin to slowly adapt towards the marine environments, towards the sea. So we have the emergence of sea reptiles, like the Nothosaurs, which are fast and agile, as well as the Ichthyosaurus, which was also adapted to consuming shellfish and things like that in the ocean. But on land, the perfect soup was brewing for the emergence of the dinosaurs. As the Earth slowly cooled from the Permian extinction event and the ecosystems stabilized slowly over time, the Archosaurs began to emerge, which were the ancestors of the dinosaurs. Among them were apex predators like Erythrosuchus, while amphibians like the Mastodonsaurus ruled the swamps about 220 million years ago. Along the coast, the vegetation began to move inland as they adapted to the drier climates. Things like ferns and conifers. They laid ground for things like the first frogs to emerge, these rivers and swamp areas. And it was from those thriving lineages of those archosaurs about 230 million years ago that the first dinosaurs began to emerge and spread around the continent. They were more adaptable, they were faster, they were more agile, they were bipedal. But just as the dinosaurs were just beginning to dominate and spread and diversify around the world, another mass extinction was headed towards the Earth. 200 million years ago, Pangaea began to split apart and separate, and this exposed cracks and fractures and allowed for magma to seep back up again. It created the gigantic Atlantic mid-ocean ridge, which is today's USA and Europe and Africa. Were all conjoined, well now they're separating and creating that huge mid-ocean ridge, which allowed so much magma and so much toxic chemicals and CO2 to form because it was burning up all that carbon in the rock. There's new rock forming, and that rock had lots of carbon, which was being burnt. CO2 was being exposed into the atmosphere, spewed out, other toxic chemicals as well. Phytoplankton were using this as all these chemicals are going to the ocean. The phytoplankton were blooming at the surface of the ocean, suffocating ocean life underneath it. On land, 50% of large vertebrates went extinct. Many of these were the large amphibians that were competing with the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs were surviving all this. While all this was happening, marine life was dying, lots of amphibians on the surface were dying, coastal animals were dying, reptiles were dying in the oceans. The dinosaurs, because they had diversified for so long in the past, they had been spread out so much, and they were adapted to the colder climates. And because they were smaller, they were lightweight and bird-like, they had respiratory systems that resembled modern-day birds, which means they didn't need so much oxygen to survive. So they could survive in low oxygen environments. And they can survive in the colder environments because they had already evolved feathers. Because remember, they were diversifying onto the continent. So the dinosaurs, about 200 million years ago, the smaller ones, they could migrate towards the cooler climates and survive just fine. Meanwhile, the entire rest of the planet was going crazy. So they literally had no competition, and they just dominated for the next 130 million years until we all know what happened 66 million years ago. It made us happen. But yeah, without those two mass extinctions, the dinosaurs would have never been so damn lucky and survived for so long. The late Cretaceous period was one of the most active periods in Earth's history, where we see some of the largest animals ever all coexisting at one time. The largest sauropods, titanosaurs, we see T-Rexes, we see Triceratops, we see large flying reptiles, pterosaurs, we see huge marine reptiles, mosasaurus, we see tons of fish and exotic sharks and huge ammonites in the oceans. At the same time, we see insects begin to diversify in the world, and we see them start pollinating plants, angiosperms with flowers. We see the first palm trees, we see the first grasses emerge, and we see the first small mammals really begin to grow into their niche of eating insects. And we see this very complex, intricate ecosystem emerge. From 100 million years ago to about 65 million years ago, the sea levels around the world were about 600 feet higher than they are today. North America was split in two by this giant sea that went all the way from the Arctic Ocean down to the Gulf of Mexico. And India was its own little island continent that was moving very quickly towards Asia. Earth was about 10 degrees warmer than it is today, with lush forests covering most of all the continents, including Antarctica. And oxygen levels in the atmosphere were about 25 to 30% versus today's 21%. At this point, dinosaurs had colonized almost every single landmass on the Earth. And this is when dinosaurs really became hyper-specialized in their individual niches. Like, for example, the T-Rex wasn't really this hunter that went after prey. It was kind of like an ambush predator. It would wait, it would surprise attack. T-Rexes had really large olfactory bulbs in their brains, which process smells. So we think that these T-Rexes could smell their prey from miles away. So they would often sit and wait for the prey to come to them, like Triceratops, and then surprise attack. And we look at Triceratops' skulls and we find scars and marks and indents, which likely implies that it was the T-Rex that fed on these Triceratops. We also see tons of armored dinosaurs during this time, like the ankylosaurs. In the oceans, we see lots of marine reptiles, marine snake-like animals, and lizard-like animals that would swim around in the ocean and prey on fish. One marine reptile called the mosasaur was a huge 50-foot-long monster. It was an apex predator. During this time, we also see some of the largest ammonites that we've ever known or seen. Some of these guys were 8 feet long. That's how long their shells were, and they weighed up to 2 tons. We also see the largest flying animal to ever exist on the Earth, Quetzalcoatlus, with a wingspan of 36 feet long and 16 feet tall in height. So it was like basically a giant giraffe flying in the air. But it wasn't just all big guys, right? Like there's still small velociraptors, for example, and troodons, which were like turkey-sized with feathers and were kind of colorful, black and white feathers. But there weren't just many different life forms, it was just that there were so many fulfilling so many different niches. A great example of this are the sauropods, which grew these long necks, these long-necked dinosaurs. One of them called Argentinosaurus, which was the largest land animal that we've ever seen before. From the top of its head to the end of its tail, it was almost 100 feet long. Like, all these guys did is eat all day long. Like, that was their niche. Eat the tops of these, like, trees. And that's why they developed these long necks. They ate 500 kilograms, or about 1,200 pounds of food every single day. That's about 45,000 grams of carbs every day, and about 180,000 calories per day. Yeah, these guys didn't know what diets were. But why are these dinosaurs so big? I mean, the oxygen levels weren't that high back then. They were maybe 20% higher than today, but that's not the only thing that explains their size. Dinosaurs had very particular bird-like respiratory systems. They didn't just have lungs like we have, right? Where you inhale and then exhale and you're out of breath by the time you do a workout, right? That's not really what those dinosaurs had. Like birds today, the reason why birds can fly for hours and hours without losing their breath is because they have air sacs that combined with lungs enable them to breathe in the inhale and exhale. Let me explain. When the dinosaurs would have inhaled, the air would have filled not their lungs first, but the air sac in the rear. And then the air, when they exhale, would go into the lungs. And then that rest of that air would go into the front air sac. So they would always have air going into their lungs. There would never be a point where they're just like out of breath. And unless they were like really overexerting themselves. So dinosaurs were getting far more oxygen per breath than we are. Plus, these air sacs were embedded in their bones and all around in their interior, which means that they were more lightweight. Their bones are able to be less heavy, less dense than we have, right? Our bones are very dense and heavy compared to dinosaur bones. Like, for example, an elephant has really dense bones, and if you were to make the elephant any bigger than it is, it would start collapsing under its own weight. But dinosaurs didn't have that problem because of the respiratory systems and because of the way their bones operated. Also, dinosaurs, like birds, didn't give live birth. They didn't have babies like we do. They just laid eggs. So they didn't have to waste all that portion of their body just so that they could give birth and carry their children for months and months and months. Also, remember, during the late Cretaceous, there was tons of food available for everybody. There's lots of trees, there's lots of animals, so they didn't have to worry about running out of food anytime soon, but they did compete together over time, and that kind of drove them to grow larger. Even the sauropods, the herbivorous sauropods that ate plants and trees, they grew larger with the carnivorous animals, right, to better defend themselves against them. So there is this coevolution, a very intricate ecosystem that developed during this time that is unmatched. It was such a prosperous time on Earth until... What was the Earth like after the dinosaurs went extinct? This brings us to the Paleocene Epoch, where the Earth was about 10 degrees warmer than it is today, and there were no polar ice caps at all at the poles. But the asteroid impact caused soot and debris to go into the atmosphere and block out the sun for years. There was a dip in global temperatures for years, and in those years, 75% of all life on the Earth went extinct. All the large dinosaurs went extinct, all the marine reptiles went extinct because of the ocean acidification disrupting the food chain, and within a few thousand years after that, almost all land animals above 30 kilograms slowly, gradually went extinct. Small mammals were able to survive, eating insects, as well as small birds and small reptiles. But shortly after the impact, global temperatures started to rise, actually fairly rapidly. The impact sparked wildfires across the world, causing all that stored carbon in the trees to be released as CO2 in the atmosphere. The asteroid itself vaporized on impact, and it also vaporized carbonate rock that it struck on land, and this caused further CO2 to be released into the atmosphere. The impact also sent shock waves through the Earth's crust and caused disruption of magma chambers. Volcanic eruptions were stirred up by this impact and spewed more CO2 in the atmosphere, as well as methane hydrates. These are ice-like crystals that are stuck on the sea floor because of the cold temperatures and pressure. But the impact disrupted those and emitted tons of methane also into the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect really starts to kick in, and by 56 million years ago, we reached the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum, which means the temperatures of the Earth on average reach 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. That's like 20 degrees warmer than it is today. Even Antarctica was fairly warm and temperate. There were actually forests and tropical trees in Antarctica during this time. People forget that below the Antarctic ice, there is an entire continent of land and all things to discover. So as the global temperature starts to rise, we see reptiles begin to dominate, take advantage of this. Like giant snakes emerge, like the Titanoboa, which reaches up to 42 feet long, one of the largest snakes to ever live, as well as a giant turtle called Carboniferous, which reaches up to 10 feet long and weighed almost a ton. As I was saying before, many flying birds survived the impact, but those birds started migrating into South America and evolved to be flightless. And this is where we see the emergence of terror birds. Some of these guys can reach up to 10 feet tall and 800 pounds. See, without the larger dinosaurs in their way, all these guys were starting to fill in these niches that they couldn't have before. So they started proliferating throughout South America and evolving these large, powerful legs that could run up to 30 miles per hour. Most of these guys were carnivorous, and they were terrifying. And then 50 million years ago, mammals began to really diversify around the world because they didn't have dinosaurs in their way. This is where we see guys like the first elephants, the Phosphatherium. This guy was about the size of a dog, about 20 kilograms, but the ancestors of modern-day elephants. We also see the first whales. Now, these first whales were not aquatic. They were actually land animals first. One of them called Pakicetus about 50 million years ago. These guys slowly moved into aquatic areas, so they became whales eventually. But that's why whales are mammals, because they evolved from land mammals. We also see during this time some larger mammals evolve on land, like the Barolambda, which was about 8 feet long. And then about 46 million years ago, the Earth begins to cool a little bit, and we see some birds migrate south into the Antarctic, where we have them start diving for food, and they become the first penguins. Should I say giant penguins, like the Anthropornis, which was about 6 feet tall. But as time went on and the Earth continued to cool down, a lot of the large reptiles began to die out. And we also see a bit of continental drift, like Antarctica begins to diverge away and separate from Australia and South America, and it becomes its own continent where it kind of just sits in the extreme polar south, and it gets stuck in these polar winds. And the polar winds trap all the cold inside of it, so it starts to build snow and ice over millions of years. And in the other parts of the world, the coastal areas, we see whales become fully aquatic now. Those smaller mammals are now more like primates and tree-dwelling monkey-like animals, our ancestors. And grasses begin to expand really around the world. Remember, grasses at this time were fairly new. So we have ruminant animals begin to take advantage of this niche. And as the Earth cooled down even more, this marks the end of the Eocene Epoch. By the Oligocene 30 million years ago, Earth begins to gradually cool down. We see permanent ice sheets now in Antarctica as it becomes isolated from South America and Australia. The Drake Passage opens up. CO2 levels also begin decreasing as the Himalayan mountain formation exposed silicate-rich rocks to the atmosphere and it sequestered lots of CO2. 28 million years ago, the Ethiopian plateau starts uplifting, and this acts as a barrier that blocks winds and rain from reaching Africa, making it cooler and drier. This influences further expansion of grasslands and savannas in Africa. And by 25 million years ago, we see some of the very first apes emerge from the old world monkeys. These guys lose their tails. As grasslands expand, trees become more sparse. They have to move on the ground more from tree to tree. Shortly after this, we start seeing more volcanic activity around the world, and temperatures start going up. CO2 levels start increasing. And by 17 million years ago, we reach the mid-Miocene climatic optimum, where temperatures peak at 3 or 4 degrees higher than today. And this causes more forests to grow in higher latitudes, where things like camels and rhinos start diversifying. This increased competition up north in Europe and Asia and likely caused the extinction of the Phanerozoic, one of the largest land mammals to ever exist. Around this time, Antarctica fully separates from South America and Australia, and this causes the East Antarctic ice sheet to continue to expand, and global temperatures continue to cool down. These global temperature fluctuations only cause more grasslands to diversify and expand around the world, and this hurts many of those larger Miocene megafauna. But this was perfect for ruminants with certain stomachs to digest those grasses to dominate during this time, and we see the early horses emerge. Initially, early horses were the size of foxes, and they had 3 or 4 individual toes. But over time, their legs grew larger and longer as they became adapted to those wider open spaces. Their feet, as they became adapted to all that running over time with their larger bodies and larger legs, their 2 side toes recessed, and it became a central toe, and eventually it became a single hoof. By 10 million years ago, global temperatures were fairly cold, they were fairly dry, and in East Africa it was dominated by savannas and grasslands where antelopes and horses and other animals were grazing. But also during this time, great apes were diversifying in Africa, and we see the gorillas split off from our chimp ancestors. And then we see our human lineage begin to split off from our chimp ancestors about 7 or 8 million years ago. So these were the very first early hominins. They weren't quite human. They were becoming human over time, but they were more chimp-like. They were not bipedal yet. But with it being so dry in East Africa during this time, they were forced to leave the trees more and more and find food and shelter. But then about 6 million years ago, as plate tectonic activity drives the Strait of Gibraltar to close, the Mediterranean Sea dries up almost completely. And this caused the extinction of up to 90% of all the species that lived around the Mediterranean Sea. And this also forced other animals like camels and antelopes to disperse from the area. But then, almost suddenly, 5.3 million years ago, the Strait of Gibraltar reopens again, and all that water comes flooding back into the Mediterranean. This is one of the largest flooding events we've ever known. 3.6 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis emerges, one of the closest ancestors to all humans. This is commonly known as Lucy. Now these guys are fully bipedal, they're walking upright all the time, but they still have ape-like features. 3.2 million years ago, global cooling intensifies and we start seeing ice caps and ice sheets in the Arctic. Grasslands and savannas continue to expand, and this pressures our human ancestors to go out and walk further and further to find food and shelter and to adapt to different diets. As water and other resources became harder and harder to find during these dry periods, our early human ancestors had to work together. Our communication skills had to evolve. Our social skills had to evolve. We were pressured to if we wanted to survive. And this leads us into the Pleistocene Epoch. The Pleistocene was the coldest epoch that complex animals had ever experienced in Earth's history. The lowest dips in temperature that this period saw, from 2.5 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, were 10 degrees colder than today globally. At this point, 30% of the Earth was covered in ice. Glaciers extended all the way down into Chicago, New York City. These cities were being covered by 1,200 meters of ice. Now, what initiated the cooling of the Pleistocene were a few things going on Earth at this time. We have the closure of the Isthmus of Panama. Tectonic plate movement closed the gaps between North and South Americas, and this stopped ocean circulation from going beyond into the Pacific from the Atlantic, and this blocked off lots of warm water going up to the Arctic, making it extra cold up there, increasing ice. The Himalayan mountains also began to really uplift at this time because the Indian plate was smashing right into the Asian continental plate. As the two plates collided, the Indian plate slid under and started to compress and crumple up the Asian plate on top of it, so it began to uplift and form the Himalayas. The collision exposed new rock to the air, which had carbon dioxide, which then the rock sequestered. So carbon dioxide levels began to drop dramatically during this time, right before the Pleistocene, causing it to cool down. And throughout the entire Pleistocene, we see alternating cycles of ice ages and warm periods and ice ages and warm periods. What drove the cycles of temperatures of the Earth were the Milankovitch cycles. The Earth rotates on its axis, but the axis isn't straight up and down. It's actually tilted by 23 degrees. This axial tilt remains the same throughout the entire year as it goes around the sun. So let's say this is the sun. In the summer, the northern hemisphere up here gets lots of direct sunlight. You can see it's going right to it. But in the winter, it gets almost no direct sunlight, and that's why it's colder in the northern hemisphere. That's why we have seasons. However, every 40,000 years, the tilt of the Earth goes through a cycle of change because the Earth itself wobbles around the sun every 40,000 years, like this. So the wobbling of the Earth over all this time changes how much sunlight and warmth is directed to certain parts of the globe. And when there's more ice sheets, it causes more albedo, which means that more sunlight gets reflected back into space. So you can see all these factors play into the climate of the Earth of the past. Now, as the Earth became cooler and drier, forests began to die out and more grasses began to dominate around the Earth. So with the expansion of these hardy grasslands that can survive the colder temperatures, we see more and more grazing animals emerge, like rhinoceroses, hippos, woolly mammoths, elephants. All these guys with the also forgotten woolly rhinoceros, they all thrived in North America, Europe, and Asia, surviving those colder temperatures with all their longer furs. In South America, we see the glyptodon. This is a giant armadillo, which also grazed on grasses and hardy plants in South America. Another notable herbivore during this time were the megatheriums. These were giant sloths that were 6 meters long, and all they did was graze on grasses and other plants. But also 2 million years ago, humans begin to emerge out of Africa and move into Europe and Asia, where they begin hunting these herbivorous animals like the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and all those other guys. And by 400,000 years ago, we see Neanderthals evolve in Europe, and they can survive the cold, harsh environments, and they have fire now. They have sophisticated tools they can use to hunt wild giant deer and rhinoceroses, and as well as woolly mammoths. 26,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum. This is when ice extent reached its peak into North America and even into Europe, where even just north of London saw huge glaciers, almost a mile thick. Sea levels across the world were 120 meters lower than they are today, which means that large parts of the southeast United States were exposed. Even Florida was much bigger than it is today. In the Bering Strait in between Alaska and Russia, which is now ocean, back then it was land. So humans could migrate from Asia into North America. And by 20,000 years ago, humans lived on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. But thousands of years of humans hunting all these animals and disrupting the environment for thousands of years, it caused the decline of many of those megafauna that we just discussed. Mammoths saw decline. Rhinoceroses saw declines. Even the Megalania, which was a giant lizard which existed in Australia at the time, went extinct about 40,000 years ago, coinciding with the arrival of humans into Australia. It's probably not a coincidence. Many of these species of the Pleistocene were on the brink of extinction because of humans. But 13,000 years ago, something strange happens on the Earth. Temperatures start to rise, but then they start dipping very quickly. And this is called the Younger Dryas period. Scientists still don't really know why the cold snap occurred at the Younger Dryas. People think it's because as glaciers melted, they left lakes, water lakes that went right into the oceans. And because of the fresh water mixed with the salt water, it caused a disruption of the ocean currents, which then led to a really cold period. Some other people think that it's because there is an impact, an asteroid impact, that caused a sudden decrease in temperature, but even though we see some iridium in these old layers of the Earth, there's no good evidence that this was the cause of the Younger Dryas. Whatever the case may be, this was the final blow for many of those species that we talked about before, the woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant sloths. They all went extinct during this time. But other animals did fortunately survive, like elephants and hippos and rhinos of today. But this marks the end of this intense epoch. The Holocene Epoch marks the final chapter in Earth's history. 11,700 years ago, we were coming out of the Ice Age. Global temperatures started rising and stabilized. For most of the Holocene, temperatures are fairly stable. By 10,000 BCE, biodiversity on Earth is pretty good. However, humans caused the extinction of about 80% of large mammals in North America, South America, and Australia. Climate change also coming out of the Ice Age also affects these larger mammals. By 9000 BCE, people start experimenting with seeds and growing crops, and agriculture begins. As the human populations grew, more and more animals were being hunted, so they were left with no choice but to start farming, as well as the fact that climate was fairly stable during this time, so they could, in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Israel, they could grow lots of wheat, barley, rice. People also start domesticating goats and sheep and cattle. By 7000 BCE, people begin settling in communities in Mesopotamia. This sparked the production of more tools to support farming, like the wheel. But as communities and population grew, all those grasslands around Mesopotamia were being converted into farms and pastures and crop fields. So all that habitat loss led to the extinction of a few animals nearby Mesopotamia, like horses and lions who preyed on those horses. By 2700 BCE, we see the emergence of early empires like the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, who built pyramids. 800 BCE, people start using iron for their tools and weapons. So we see more and more people mining copper ores and iron ores around the Earth, and more habitats being lost. By the year 1000 CE, there's a medieval warm period in the northern hemisphere, where Greenland actually begins to get warm enough for agriculture. So we see the Vikings begin exploring Greenland, and they get there and they start hunting seals and fish, and they start altering those habitats. And by the 17th century, we see a scientific revolution, a renaissance, where Copernicus discovers that the sun is the center of the solar system. Newton discovers the laws of gravity, laws of motion. And there's a rise in literacy and art and science and philosophy around the world. The Dutch settlers and Europeans start exploring these islands where they discover dodo birds. and they begin hunting them and destroying their habitats, and they go extinct around the 17th century. And by the mid-1800s is when the Industrial Revolution begins, and this is when things really start heating up. Literally, people start using coal and steam engines to transport goods. They start building factories and heavy machinery. This causes a subsequent rise in urbanization, which causes more pollution, more CO2 emissions. In 1914, we see the passenger pigeon go extinct. This bird was really prevalent in North America. There's billions of them, but they were hunted to extinction by people. In 1934, the Tasmanian tiger went extinct as people hunted that to extinction because they blamed it on their livestock losses in Australia. By 1989, climate change alters habitats in Cuba, such that the golden toad goes extinct. In 2011, the West African black rhino was poached to extinction. So is the northern white rhino in 2018. And today, most of our land is being destroyed for animal agriculture, where we see 90 billion animals being unalived every year for food. Cows, pigs, chickens, sheep. In fact, today, if we were to count up all the biomass of mammals in the world, mammals that are wild only count for 4% of all the biomass. 96% of the mammalian biomass is farmed animals and humans. Humans have caused the rapid rise in CO2 levels. They're about 430 parts per million now, which is higher than we've seen in millions of years. So is methane levels. And since the 1880s, global temperatures have risen 1.2 degrees Celsius, or 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the most rapid rise in global temperatures that the Earth has seen in millions of years. So where are we on the chart? We're at the very end here, where you see that big spike. That's human activity. You might say that over here temperatures are higher, but those fluctuations took thousands and thousands and millions of years even to happen. We're causing the same change, if not more change, in just 100 years. And scientists are saying that at this rate, global temperatures are going to rise to 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher than 1880 temperatures by 2050. Humans have also generated a tremendous amount of plastics around the world. There are huge giant garbage patches full of plastics in the oceans that are twice the size of Texas. We've created so much plastic that now we see little microplastics in our food, in our water, in the air, in the oceans, and in the soil. And this can affect plants and trees and how they grow. In fact, there's so much plastic now that scientists are beginning to see a little permanent layer of plastic in the geological layers. It's impossible to count every species, but if you were to generally get an idea of how many species humans have caused to the extinction of in the Holocene, it's around hundreds of thousands of species. And scientists say that if we keep this up at this rate, all these extinctions, that by the next century, 30% of all life on the Earth will go extinct because of us. Scientists are worried about us causing a sixth mass extinction. It's the first time in Earth's history that one single species has that ability. Now, I don't want this video to be all doom and gloom, right? I'm not here to say humans bad, but we have caused lots of impacts on the Earth since we've gotten here. So, although we have lots of power to destroy the planet, we also have lots of power to improve on the planet. As we've learned through this series about the Earth and all of its past events, I hope you gain a new appreciation for our planet, for our place in it, and a new perspective on why we should care and why this planet is so special to us. That's the end of the series.